intent of these events put on by WealthShare is to provide value to you, to provide tangible, useful information that you can use in your own investing journey. WealthShare is a private REIT, so we do obviously invest in the Alberta market. We invest in multifamily real estate, but a lot of our passive investors are also active investors. So it's important that we're all, using good information, and we're really supportive of our investors also building their own portfolios. So today we're very excited to have Taylor Pardy joining us today from CMHC, and he's going to give us his CMHC kind of rental market outlook. It's a critical time of year as we move into the end of the year and into early next year when it comes to the outlook that CMHC provides us at the beginning of every year. So thanks so much for being here, Taylor.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And I'm just going to let you kind of rock and roll, Taylor. I'm going to turn it over to you. If you need anything, let me know, but I'm going to kind of turn it over and let you do your thing.
Sounds great. Thanks, Natasha. And thanks everybody for being here. So like Natasha said, I'm going to give a little bit of a sense of what we're thinking for the outlook for the rental market, particularly in Calgary and Edmonton. But I'll touch briefly on some of the other markets, smaller cities as well. And just give you a sense of sort of what we're thinking going into, I guess, forecasting this year.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, I have sort of 7 key points that I want to touch on in this presentation. So the first one being that demand for rental, remains strong, and that's being driven by migration into, particularly into the major Alberta markets, so Calgary and Edmonton. We know that the pace of international migration, that remains a bit of a risk to rental demand in the near term, in the sense that, if we see some slowing, that will certainly take away from demand to some degree. Just given some of there's been policy changes, which I'll touch on in a minute. And yeah, I'll go in deeper detail on that. Number 3, we don't see as much risk on the interprovincial migration side of things. So people moving from other provinces to particularly the large markets. Just given the relative affordability picture, that's still very much in play on the rents and pricing side. On the ownership side of the market, Alberta markets are still to a very large degree affordable in relative terms, and so we're seeing a lot of migration from other provinces that are experiencing more acute affordability issues, particularly folks from BC and Ontario. Number 4 is that the labor market is still on solid footing in absolute and relative terms. Seem to be sort of weathering the higher interest rate storm relatively well. And so, that's definitely a positive for the province and for the 2 largest markets. And number 5, interest rates look set for some continued downward movement in our view, along with mortgage rates. And so, the risk on that side of things when it comes to rental becomes more people potentially moving into ownership, as those rates decline, and we have some policy changes that might influence things as well. Point number 6, on the supply side, we're seeing rental completions coming in quite strong so far this year. So we've seen a lot of purpose-built rental get underway over the past couple of years. We're starting to see a lot more of that coming to market in recent quarters. And so the supply side dynamic is sort of changing a little bit. So, we're going to have to sort of reevaluate, okay, what does the demand picture look like with the sort of changes in, economic growth and the labor market that we've seen, in addition to sort of this, supply really starting to hit the market. What does that mean? And lastly, point number 7, geopolitical risks, those are heating up again, not only in terms of, the ongoing, war in the Ukraine, but also, risks in the Middle East have sort of, heated up recently. There's been, escalation in the conflict, with Iran directly attacking Israel and sort of vowing to strike back and things like that. It's gone from or I guess it's sort of increased risks related to the Middle East right now, and so there's risks related to infrastructure and things like that to be mindful of. And we saw immediately after some of these attacks happen, sort of more of a risk premium start to get built in, to oil prices and things like that. So things to keep an eye on, in addition to the fact that there's other things going on in North America as well. We have the U.S. election coming up that could have some implications going forward. Things like changing tariff regimes and things like that. So those are the 7 key points. I'll touch quickly on policy changes, that are in the back of our minds, and then I'll jump into what does the data look like and what are we thinking. So these are sort of potential considerations or risks for the rental market. So limitations on the number of student visas afforded to each province. For example, our assessment is the impact for Alberta is not going to be super high, given that Alberta's, international, student influx was sort of already in line with sort of if you look at a per capita distribution across the country, we weren't too far off in that sense. So it's still, it would be considered a negative demand side risk, but we don't see it as being, too large at this time. Number 2, there has been or the government has announced essentially the desire to decrease the number of temporary residents in the country as a proportion of the total population. So going from 6.5% of Canada's total population down to 5% by 2026. So this is also a negative demand side risk. In general, we know that a lot of growth on the international migration side of things in recent years has been from non-permanent residents, and that has been a key contributor to rental demand as well. So we don't have as much detail on this at the moment. There is more details, as far as I understand, to be coming out in November on this piece. So it's hard to sort of assess what the risk is going to be at this point in time. So, but it's something to sort of be mindful of, and we'll certainly be mindful of it when we're putting together our numbers once we see more details in November. Point number 3, 30-year insured mortgage amortizations for first-time buyers and purchasers of new homes. This is also sort of a negative demand side risk for the rental market, in the sense that, in addition to mortgage rates generally trending downwards, this may actually help people get into the ownership side of the market, whether it's in the resale or the new home market. And so that's something we could see more of a rotation out of the rental market, as opposed to, really we've seen such strong demand in the rental market in the past few years, particularly with interest rates being so high that kind of deterred some people from jumping into the ownership side. So jumping into some of the data, population growth in Calgary and Edmonton, as I'm sure everybody here knows, has been very, very significant in the past few years. So Calgary somewhere in the ballpark of 6% as of, I think 2023 is the latest estimate. Edmonton is, over 4%, but 4.5%, I think. And so these are, very, very strong numbers historically. And, that really comes from that migration side of things, and particularly the international migration side of things has never been, or hasn't been this strong for a number of decades. So as that little picture just showed, there's a lot of pressure on the market, and there's some anxiety related to that, right? And so, just on that point that I was saying, the international migration point, these, the contribution of international migration to population growth has been sort of outsized in the past few years. And so, as I said a few times already, that's really contributed to rental demand. Interprovincial migration has also been there, and it has been as strong as past booms in Alberta. If you think of the 2010s or the mid 2000s inclusive, It's been as strong as that, but certainly from a population pressure side of things, we're feeling it certainly more on the international migration side. Uh, not to mention that natural increase in the population is also generally positive, with births minus deaths being generally positive, given that Alberta has more of a younger population than some other provinces. And, this is important in terms of looking at this graph because when you think about rental demand in general, international migration and actually the Bank of Canada a little while ago did a little bit of analysis on this, which we found interesting. Um, really when it comes to home ownership rates amongst, international migrants, it takes about 10 years for folks to get to sort of the Canadian average in terms of that ownership rate. And so when you think about the first few years when people are showing up or arriving in Canada, wherever they might arrive, that's predominantly rental demand right off the bat. And that stays that way for, a number of years going forward, actually. Whereas the interprovincial migration side of things, that's historically been a little bit more 50-50. You get some folks, particularly young people, showing up and deciding, they may not have a lot of, equity or savings behind them initially. And so, half of those folks might end up in the rental market, but the other half might show up with some savings or some equity, and they're able to purchase a home right away. So you still see rental demand from the interprovincial side, but certainly it's not as dominant as the international side. And so this is net international migration by type into Alberta. And this is, so you can see net non-permanent residence in the light purple has been sort of a big contributor in that sense. However, as we're seeing, so there's two things going on. As we're seeing the economy, in terms of the pace of growth slow down a little bit, that takes pressure off of the need for additional labor, means people are less likely to, come to Canada if there's no job to meet them and stuff like that. So we've seen the non-permanent resident side sort of pull back a little bit. And if you look at the next graph, this is net non-permanent residents by type. And so we've got it broken down into the different types of non-permanent residents, including study permit holders and work permit holders, for example. And in the pink is work permit holders. And that's really where we've seen the biggest decline. So really, when you think about economics and policy coming together, the economics is certainly a big piece of this puzzle, even though we also have some policy changes maybe coming down the pipe here in the next month or so. So it's important to keep that in mind, that it's both economics and policy. But the point is that that's actually, we're still seeing growth, and it's still fairly strong growth, but that growth is slowing, and that's something to be mindful of. And this is net migration into Alberta by province of origin. And so this is the interprovincial migration piece of things. And, really Alberta is a net gainer from basically everywhere in Canada right now. There's nobody sort of on a net basis leaving. And BC and Ontario, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, are sort of the biggest contributors to this gain. We still see, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Oh, should I hit admit? Somebody, there we go. And so that's, those are the two biggest drivers. Saskatchewan and Manitoba are also in there. They've always generally been there historically in terms of contributing positively to Alberta's growth. We've also seen Quebec go net positive again as well. And Atlantic Canada has also been there. So it's basically, everybody's coming to Alberta right now. It's creating some, pressures on the market essentially, and in such a short period of time too. It's only been like a few years since we've seen this amount of pressure. But certainly it's an Alberta party right now. And luckily we're seeing builders and developers in Alberta being quite responsive. It's, a different story to some other provinces that don't have that level of responsiveness. But Alberta, we've had record high housing starts for the past like 3 years. We're starting to see completions in, very high volumes. And so supply is really, starting to come to market in higher volume, which is generally a good thing and is going to be actually supportive of growth of the economy and the labor market. Um, and just breaking this down even further, I'm being fairly exhaustive on these population charts and demographics charts because they are extremely important. This is net international migration by age group, and so you can see the red and the sort of dark blue are the roughly 18 to 44 age cohorts. And individuals within these age cohorts generally tend to be fairly supportive of rental demand. And given that these are international migrants, as I said, in many cases, the vast majority of these folks are ending up in the rental market essentially, and so generally seeing positives there. We will see what happens with changes to student visas and stuff like that if we see any impact on that 18 to 24 cohort. But thus far, based on the quarterly data we have, haven't really seen much of an impact there. And same thing for interprovincial migration. This is just broken down by age group, and it's similar: 18 to 44. Those 18 to 24 and 25 to 44 are sort of the two age cohorts that are the most positive. However, we've also seen both other age categories generally have been positive in the past number of quarters. So yeah, it's sort of demand is sort of coming from all age groups to some degree. However, keep in mind this is interprovincial, so many of these folks may end up in the ownership side, for example. And just jumping into some of what's happening in the labor market, this is the unemployment rate by age group, and really the gains that we've seen in the unemployment rate more recently, like mainly reflect a slowing in the ability of the labor market to absorb so many workers. Alberta's not completely immune to the effects of higher interest rates, and so we have seen some slowing in sort of spending on the part of consumers and subsequently businesses and their hiring intentions essentially. And so really that young adult cohort 15 to 20, or I guess sort of teenage and young adult cohort 15 to 24 has seen more of a increase in the unemployment rate, whereas 25 to 54 it has increased somewhat, but it's not incredibly out of line, and we do know that in many cases, given population growth and given that a good chunk of it is driven by international migration, there's been some analysis on this that basically newcomers are arriving, and it's just taking a bit longer for them to find employment right now. So it's almost frictional unemployment in the sense that you arrive, you're still able to find a job, but maybe instead of it taking you a couple months, it takes you 4, 5, 6 months kind of thing. And so this is just a breakdown of some of those labor market indicators. So Calgary on the left and Edmonton on the right-hand side. So we can see that the labor force in general, as the line going through the graph, has been growing still at a pretty solid pace. We know that full-time employment looks like it's starting to pick up again. It sort of slowed down in response to higher interest rates for a little while there. It looks like it's coming back for Calgary. It's starting to come back for Edmonton. But we're certainly, Edmonton is a good example of this effect of population continues to grow. labor force continues to grow as a result because people show up and they're looking for work. And so the actual contribution to the labor force in terms of the number of people who are unemployed is actually higher. So that those purple bars on the Edmonton graph is just those are people who are here looking for work. Maybe it's taking a little bit longer than previously anticipated to find those jobs. And this is job vacancy rates. So Canada's overall job vacancy on the left, and then job vacancies by province or region on the right-hand side. And so in general, we're sort of back to a pre-pandemic level of job vacancies. So, that's sort of the impact of interest rates being higher, slowing down spending and business investment and, hiring intentions and things like that. And so, we've sort of come out of this period of a very hot economy, and we seem to be back into more of a normal territory. And we're seeing that, with the Bank of Canada yesterday with their monetary policy report, that's also showing, that we seem to be beyond some of this at this point. And on the right-hand side, Alberta, same story. Essentially, we're back to pre-pandemic job vacancies to a large degree and across, most provinces as well. We've kind of navigated that downward shift. And, same in terms of job vacancy rates by industry. Those have also come down, even in sectors where there was really an acute labor shortage. So accommodation and food services, for example, the job vacancy rate was quite high for quite some time. That's sort of come down, and it's come down basically across the board. Healthcare is sort of a little bit of an outlier in my mind. I think there is still significant demand to fill jobs in the healthcare space, and there's some challenges there. But that is not necessarily just an Alberta story. That is sort of a nationwide story as well. And this is short and longer term, rates, as well as the Bank of Canada's policy rate, or the midpoint of their operating band, and the 5-year bond yield I've put there as well. And so we've generally been seeing, mortgage rates, especially the 5-year mortgage rates, sort of following the bond market downward. And this is generally the relationship we would expect. Short-term rates, since the summer, since the Bank of Canada started to slowly ease their policy rate, those are coming down. We're still in an environment where variable mortgage rates are higher than those longer term fixed rates. But we seem to be, now with this, 50 basis point decrease on the part of the Bank of Canada yesterday, and the explanations and data provided in the monetary policy report, we seem to be, moving in the right direction, and maybe we'll get back at some point to a position where variable mortgage rates are below fixed rates. And this is just CPI, speaking of the Bank of Canada's move yesterday, this is CPI inflation, all items inflation in the blue on the left-hand graph. And so that was 1.6% in September. So it's actually slightly below the midpoint of the Bank of Canada's sort of operating band. So the midpoint being 2%. Overall inflation in Canada is down all the way to 1.6%. And actually, I overlaid CPI inflation excluding shelter altogether. And if you look at it that way, we're actually all the way down to 0.4%. Shelter is the biggest component currently contributing to those inflationary measures at the moment. And so if you look on the right-hand side graph, this is CPI for rented accommodation and the CPI for owned accommodation. And, really they're still elevated. Owned accommodation, we're seeing that pace of growth, or that inflation measure starting to come down at a fairly rapid clip. But on the rent side, we haven't really seen much change there yet, but that may in terms of year-over-year growth, we may see that change over time here as well. It's just a very interesting period of time in that sense because the um, overall inflation and the contribution of shelter to that, um, you know, I can't remember a time, I guess, um, looking back historically when it's been like this high of contribution. Um, and so this is interesting because the only other things that are currently positive in terms of year-over-year inflation are food at 2.75%, health and personal care is 3%, alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis are up 3% year over year, and all other categories of inflation are actually negative. And if you look at things like, energy prices, for example, they are quite negative in terms of their contribution to overall inflation. Um, so yeah, there is some risks to this. Elevated shelter inflation, may prevent too rapid of a decline in interest rates, for example, if that reignites housing demand, um, and sucks up a lot of the supply that has come onto the market, for example. So I think it's the Bank of Canada has a bit of a tough job here to do. Um, so this is just indicators that we have or we produce at CMHC. I'm not sure I need to spend too much time on this piece. I'm sure you all know of our data and sort of what we do. So I won't spend too much time on that, but if you want to go back and look at that slide later, please feel free. So this next slide is just digging into some of the rental numbers. These numbers would be from, about a year ago kind of thing. So at this point, they are a little bit, um, behind, but they still sort of point to some of the trends that we're seeing. And it's important to keep in mind that um, we are going to be pushing to release our latest rental market numbers a bit early this year as well. So we're shooting for like mid-December. So I would, certainly keep that in mind. And I just wanted to share that with you guys. So basically, what are we seeing in Edmonton and Calgary in particular? Well, about a year ago, we have been seeing strong increases in the rental universe in both markets for purpose-built rentals. This makes sense just given the amount that's under construction. We hadn't at that point seen the same response in terms of expansion of the stock in some of the smaller markets. Um, we might start to see that going forward, just given that um, international and interprovincial migration in some of these smaller cities is also positive and is contributing to a lot of housing demand there as well. So it's not even just a big city story in Alberta. It's sort of a almost across the board story. And, this just sort of highlights the point that, even though we're seeing, big expansions in a historical sense in, growth in the rentals stock, occupancy or growth in occupancy has just consistently outpaced that in the big cities and in smaller cities. And so that's why we've continually seen declines in the vacancy rate. And so this is just vacancy rate and average rent growth for 2-bedroom units for Calgary. So the vacancy rate at 1.4% as of October of last year. And, very strong rent growth in a historical sense. Certainly not, what we saw in the mid 2000s. We saw 18.3% in 1 year in the mid 2000s. We're not quite there yet, but we do expect that we do expect to see strong rent growth this year as well. And I know there's some other data sources and stuff like that that primarily look at asking rents, and we look at asking rents as well and the trend there. And with the sort of supply that we're seeing coming into the market right now, um, seeing some either plateauing or even slight decreases in some of those asking rent numbers makes a lot of sense. When it relates to our survey, because we survey existing units as well with existing tenants in them, we do expect rent growth to be fairly strong in that segment, because we're not just talking about um, new units coming to the market, or a market or an existing unit becoming available and maybe shooting for a higher rent rate, things like that. We're talking about across the board what people are actually paying, essentially. And so I think we're going to continue to see strong rent growth in that respect, even if we start to see some leveling off in asking rents. And Edmonton, this is same graph, vacancy rate and average rent growth for two beds. Vacancy rate came in at 2.4% in October of last year. Year over year rent growth for two bedroom units, for occupied units kind of thing, came in at 6.4. So we expect that to be stronger as well this coming year. Edmonton, in terms of its population growth rate over the past year, has actually picked up. That first year, or I guess if we were looking at things from last year's perspective, up until then, it had had a bit of a slower population growth rate than Calgary. It wasn't feeling the same pressure, but I think things are sort of evening out at the moment. And so in my mind, I would expect some fairly strong rent growth there, maybe some continued decline in vacancy. And this is just vacancy rates across, so not only for Edmonton and Calgary, but looking at some of those smaller markets as well. And just, given the population pressures I've mentioned and how it's not just a big city phenomenon right now, we also have, quite low vacancy rates in some of the smaller cities as well, particularly Red Deer at 0.8%. That's quite low in a historical sense. And so this is just same sample change in, rents for all unit sizes on the left-hand side. So this is change in sort of, for the most part, occupied unit rents. And so it was quite significant in 2023 across all of these markets. Partially a demand story, partially a cost increase story. So, even for Wood Buffalo, which is Fort McMurray, we saw a 5.1% increase, even though the vacancy rate was still over 9%. And that is sort of, as far as I've been able to gather, that's sort of a cost recovery story in terms of increasing costs related to higher interest rates, higher utility costs, labor costs, all that kind of stuff for maintenance. So that's why we saw, even in Fort McMurray, we saw that 5.1% increase, and then stronger elsewhere. And average two-bedroom rents, this is for occupied units, mind you. So the numbers, you might be like, whoa, that's not really, that seems a bit low or whatever, but that's for occupied units sort of across the board. And that's a point in time estimate. So yeah, those are where two-bed rents are at based on that data. And this is historical condominium apartment rental units. So this is sort of the rental condo stock, and how that contributes to competition for purpose-built rentals. And so Calgary, naturally has a higher rental condo stock, and it grew by about 370 units last year. Edmonton's stock is a bit lower, but grew by about over 1,200 units last year. Vacancy rates were low in the rental condo space as well for both of these markets. And the thing to keep in mind with this is, there's really not a lot under construction in terms of apartment condos in Edmonton right now, but there was a number of years there with a bit of a supply overhang, or there was a lot of inventories of unsold apartment condos that have been slowly coming down in the past couple of years. And there may be some, investor units that are just that sort of came back to the market this past year. And so you see a bit of a stronger increase in Edmonton in that respect. But at the same time, it hasn't grown nearly as much as the purpose-built rental space, or the expansion in that purpose-built rental stock, because that'd still be about 3% higher in terms of the rate of growth for Edmonton, and for Calgary, probably more like 5 or 6 times that 370 unit increase. So it's really the purpose-built space has been where it's at. Um, and rents in purpose-built units compared to the rental condo segment on average, for Calgary, there's still sort of a premium um, when it comes to rental condos. Part of that may be just older, I guess, older purpose-built rental stock, and maybe as we start to see more new purpose-built rental units hit the market and get occupied, we'll start to see that gap sort of close. But at least it hasn't closed for now. Whereas in Edmonton, things are a little bit more even, on a statistical significance basis. Some of these numbers wouldn't even, show as statistically different. So, yeah, very interesting, different markets, very interesting dynamics. And then this is just average rents for purpose-built rental units. So including all ages of construction, and then narrowing it down to a bit, a smaller cohort of newer units. So buildings constructed in 2015 and beyond, and just looking at what that rent differential looks like. And even though rents have been rising across the board, whether it's old or new stock, newer apartments still have a premium of around 24, 25% ish relative to the overall stock. So gets you a little bit closer probably to where market rates are at. And yeah, 24 and 23% for Calgary and Edmonton respectively. And this is just a graph looking at year-over-year changes, percent change in rents for units that turned over versus units that had the same tenant. And so this sort of just visualizes almost differences across provinces, differences across regulatory regimes. For example, many of these other large markets across Canada, would be subject to some measure of rent control. For example, so you see, stark differences in those percent increases year over year between, if it was the same tenant that stayed in the unit and what that rent increase looked like versus if the unit turned over and it's sort of resetting to the market rate. So Vancouver, for example, it's a good example, 6% for, same tenant unit, and then for a unit that turned over, rents increased 34% when it went back to the market. We don't have that much of or as much of that issue, I guess, in Alberta because we don't have that same regulatory regime. And Calgary was up for 11% for units that had the same tenant and 20% for units that turned over. So those are still strong numbers. But the difference is that we don't generally see those kind of strong numbers for very long historically in Alberta. If you look in past periods, past boom times, you get 2 or 3 years of fairly rapid increase in rents, and then typically things will level off. Whereas if you look over the long run, in places like Toronto or Vancouver, places with different regulatory regimes, this is sort of an every year thing where the same tenant numbers are still consistently low and in line with sort of rent increase guidelines, and then you see turned over units are always resetting much higher. And Edmonton, for that matter, not experiencing as much population growth as Calgary last year, not under as much pressure. We saw 5% and 7% for same tenant and turned over units last year. And this is just rental apartment construction and condos under construction, because a portion of those will end up in the secondary rental market, just to see where things are at. And so you can see the bold lines in the blue and red are Calgary and Edmonton apartment rentals under construction. There is a fair number of them, like in the ballpark of 7,000 units each currently. And so, that has really been a phenomenon of the past couple of years, and we're actually seeing a lot of units, like I said, coming to the market at the moment. The condo space is also fairly hot for Calgary, and so a portion of those are likely to be investor units that will also come to the market and represent a certain amount of competition for the purpose-built rental side. Edmonton, on the other hand, the apartment condo space hasn't truly recovered yet. They did have a supply overhang for a number of years there. And, we are seeing stronger demand in the resale market for apartment condos. That's sort of picking up there. And we are seeing slowly people getting back. We're seeing, starts increase in the apartment condo space, but certainly not to the same degree as we've seen in Calgary as of yet. So perhaps less competition in that space over there, but at the same time, Edmonton does have uh, a larger purpose-built rental stock in general. And as I mentioned a few times, this is purpose-built apartment rental completions in Calgary and Edmonton. So Calgary on the left and Edmonton on the right-hand side. And as you can see in the graphs, really late 2023, 2024, it's been quite strong in terms of the number of completions. So this is sort of a supply dynamic going into forecasting that we are going to have to gauge in addition to some of those demand side risks, as I mentioned. Another thing to keep in mind is actually, some of the zoning changes that we've seen in both Calgary and Edmonton, means additional competition in the rental space. With some of these smaller unit types gaining in popularity and more people wanting to sort of build them, essentially. So Edmonton made, their blanket rezoning changes, and those were implemented January 1 of 2024, and that allowed for a lot more secondary suites, laneway homes, above garage suites, things like that. Calgary was August 6th when these zoning changes came into force, and so there's just been a significant increase in interest here, and in particularly in Calgary, it's kind of gotten asymptotic in terms of the number of people looking to develop suites. That may have something to do with other policy supports as well, in the sense of being able to get up to $10,000, per secondary suite in the city that's on offer at the moment. So in general, just in some increased competition is certainly, a risk, at least when you're looking at the purpose-built side. And so this is just our expectations for vacancy rates and two-bedroom average rents over the next few years. This was completed in terms of this forecast as of, early this year, essentially. Like these would have been finalized in like February. And so, given some of the policy announcements that we've seen, given, changes in the economy, that we've seen, we are going back to, reevaluate these numbers. We still see demand being quite strong in terms of rental demand, but it's just a matter of, okay, how do we sort of bear this out in our models? And so we're in the process of doing this. Certainly on the demand side, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of risks, but those risks mainly involve a slowing in growth as opposed to growth in demand really falling off, right? So, I don't have an immense amount of concerns in that respect. It's just a matter of what the numbers look like. And so as of earlier this year, my thought was, really the kind of population pressure we're under, we're just going to continue to see vacancy rates declining for the next couple of years before we maybe see supply catch up. And, I still think that is largely going to be the case. What the numbers shake out to, we had 1.4% vacancy rate in Calgary in 2023. Whether it's 1.1 or it comes in at 1.5, in my mind, that is still an extremely tight rental market. And, below 2%, that's quite tight. And below 1%, that is very, very, very tight. So I think that we are going to continue to see some tightness in the next year or two before we really see supply start to catch up in a meaningful way anyway. And what that means is we're going to see fairly strong rent growth in this year and to a lesser extent next year. And then, we'll start to sort of level off in terms of that pace of rent growth, slowly over time. And I think that's going to be the same story with Edmonton. I think we're going to continue to see vacancy rates certainly below 2%, in the next year or two, and then maybe we see supply and demand come back more back into balance by 2026. And then two bedroom rents, same story. We're seeing an increase in rents over the next year or two, and then we'll start to see a bit more stability or slower pace of rent growth in a couple of years. And so, yeah, just to end off with those 7 key points before I take any questions. Like I said, demand remains strong, driven by those 2 migration factors. International migration remains a risk to rental demand in the near term. We'll see what the potential policy changes that the federal government comes out with. We should have more info on that in November. But as of now, it looks like we may see a slowing in growth as opposed to a complete drop in growth, which is, generally, I guess, positive when it comes to consistent rental demand. And on the interprovincial migration side of things, don't see much risks there. Like I said, labor market is still on solid footing, and it looks like we may be picking up again, especially as interest rates come down. There is a risk with interest rates coming down that we see more people moving into the ownership side who were maybe constrained by higher rates previously. So we may see some more rotation start to happen out of the rental market, which may take some pressure off. And, given that we also have strong rental completions coming to the market. And so, these are all things to keep in mind. And then lastly, those geopolitical risks I mentioned at the beginning. I won't go through those again. So that's it for me. Yeah, I hope you found the presentation informative, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Taylor. That was amazing. I'm sure there's
Good.
probably lots of questions, but that was really insightful. And I really appreciate your overview. Does anyone have a question? I know there was one in the chat. I could maybe reference that one first. So for Calgary, I think we passed the 15,000 basement suite mark now of like secondary suites in Calgary. They're legal on the secondary suite registry. There's still plenty of illegal ones, but there's a question in regards to a lot of these detached homes and semi-detached homes having these side entrances. Do we think that will impact the apartment rental demand in a negative way, or any kind of light you can shed on that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, and I'll use Edmonton as my basis for my answer, kind of thing, because they have been, um, I guess, a little bit more proactive in some of the zoning changes that they've made over the past few years and stuff like that, and they've had some of their blanket rezoning policies in place for longer than Calgary up until this point, and we are seeing pretty strong demand for things like secondary suites and backyard suites, and the above garage suites are becoming quite popular and things like that. So I think if now that we have a change in zoning in Calgary that will allow for a lot more of this, I think it does come into play, especially when it comes to new builds and people maybe saying like, hey, we can include a mortgage helper right off the bat. And especially, when you have incentives like the city offering, up to $10,000 per suite and things like that, I think it's going to come into play a bit more.
Mm.
It's something that we're keeping an eye on for sure when it comes to our forecasting. We're like, okay, how huge is this going to be?
Yeah.
And to be honest, I think some of the zoning changes that have been made in both cities over the past few years have been these are sort of historic accomplishments kind of thing. Like
Oh.
this kind of thing hasn't happened in many, many decades.
Mhm.
So I think we should keep that in mind, and that it could be sort of a step change in how rental actually works going forward.
Awesome. Thank you.
When you're looking at purpose-built rentals, are you including the office conversions that are taking place in Calgary?
Um, it's a very good question. We would be if the entire building or the intent of the entire building that is being converted is for long-term rental.
Okay.
So that's the one consideration. If it's a mixture of units or if it's a mixture of like condo and rental and different
Mhm.
things like that, then maybe not. But if it is purely long-term rental, in terms of its conversion, we would be.
So how would you handle the Telus building in downtown Calgary where it has long-term rental, condo, and office?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if I was to hazard a guess, and maybe my surveys folks might yell at me for even guessing, if I was to hazard a guess, my guess is they would look at the rental and condo, and we wouldn't cover the office side of things. They would look at the rental and condo separately and consider that separately in our data. And so the rental might end up in our long-term rental stock, the purpose-built rental stock. Um, and because we would have to keep track of it, essentially, we try to keep track of everything. And so we wouldn't essentially let that slide in terms of a large number of units coming to market and us not knowing about it. So um, that's my guess on how they would handle it. I'm sure they would lambast me and give more detail than I can, but yeah.
And
They were
then
great, actually. I got a call from the surveyors a few weeks ago about some of our properties, and they were awesome. Like they were on top of their information. It was fantastic.
Yeah. No, they definitely put in a lot of effort to collect a lot of this data, and so yeah, it's cool that I get to work with it and sort of present it and talk about it. But yeah,
Also,
I'm
way to
sure
go.
they could tell you a lot more.
Yeah. I have a question. So there's particular buildings, particularly in Northeast Calgary, that were like they are condominium buildings, but predominantly bought by investors at pre-construction, predominantly like Ontario investors buying at pre-construction level. And then we have, 100, 250 units kind of coming on board all at once. And it's a mix of owners and what they're going to do with it. And some of them are selling it. How would CMHC look at that data when like we don't for sure know, of course, how many of those are going to be rental units versus homeowner units, but we do know that predominantly the investors were investors, like it was for investment product. How would they look at that building in that case?
Um, and so you said it was pre-construction, like they purchased it
Yeah.
pre-construction, and the intent is to have different, tenures, within it.
Yeah, like
Um,
it's a pre-construction condo bought, from the developer at pre-construction phase. They might buy one unit, they might buy several, but really most of these owners are not in Calgary. So likely of a big portion of them to hit the rental market, I would presume.
yeah, and I mean, that's something that we've, generally heard more and more in terms of, let's say investors from other provinces,
Yeah.
particularly BC and Ontario, actually, getting into the market a bit more. And it's not just, I'll preface this with it's not just major Alberta markets anymore. It's actually expanded out even to, I was in Winnipeg a few weeks back and people were talking about the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
Um, so in terms of how we would handle that, we generally, anything that's coming to market, we follow it through both, having access to pre-construction data, but also things like building permit data on the back end that we get directly from municipalities and things like that as well. And so we would know who's potentially, building and or managing the property and things like that. And so we would get our information through those means, typically in talking to some of those folks. Um, and that is sort of how we see the evolution of the rental condo space and how we track that universe essentially. Um, and so that's something that if we are seeing this trend, and it is a big trend, we're seeing a lot of units coming to the market, I would expect that we would see the secondary rental market or the rental condo space, that rental stock start to really climb. as those units come to market. I don't think we've necessarily seen that yet. We have seen some increase, but it's not on sort of a grand scale as of yet.
Okay, great, thank you. Crystal asked, when does the new rental data for municipalities come out? I think you said middle of December is the target.
Yeah, we're targeting mid-December. We want to get it out before Christmas, and so all of that data, including on a municipal level, should be available, barring no hiccups or anything like that. I'm just going to preface with that, but yeah, we're really hoping. We've heard that a lot from industry when we changed in recent years and we couldn't get things out fast enough and stuff like that, people didn't really like that. So we're doing our best to sort of find ways to get this out faster, because we know it's very, very important, especially as you're going into the new year.
Yeah, plans for the new year. Crystal had a second point about the CMHC average rental income to determine affordable units. That is driven by the consumer price index per market. I think that's what you're referring to, Crystal, there. Does that make sense, Taylor?
Yeah, I think that's the rental component of CPI is how they allow it to grow.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. So in that sense, based on the slides that I showed today, that that increase would still be higher than overall CPI at the moment.
Thanks so much, Taylor. That was fantastic.
That was awesome. Thank you.
We had like a lot of interested people on this topic. I know the recording is going to be very popular, and we just really, really appreciate your time. We know it's a busy time of year for you, and providing us your insights today means a lot to our community. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for reaching out. And yeah, if you have any more questions, my info is on that slide there. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.